Hello and welcome. It's a special honor for the Latin American, Caribbean, and European Division at the Library of Congress to partner with the Consortium of Latin American Studies program, CLASP, in this virtual celebration of creative works that engage young people with stories about Latin America, the Caribbean, and Latinx communities in the United States. Children's and young adult books are tremendous gateways for learning and understanding, and it has been a pleasure to work with these authors, our Latinx librarian, Maria Daniela Danny Thurber, Denise Woltering, and Colleen McCoy while planning this conversation. My heartfelt thanks to all authors and illustrators who helped amplify voices from across Latin American and Latinx communities, and especially those with us today. Aida Salazar, Shamile Sayed Mendez, Angela Burke Kunkel, and Raul Gonzalez III, and to our facilitator, Ruth Kidoa. My name is Suzanne Shadle. It is my privilege to oversee a tremendous team of librarians in the Latin American, Caribbean, and European Division. As we reach the end of National Hispanic Heritage Month, I invite you to listen to our 2021 National Hispanic Heritage Month release of La Biblioteca podcast, Season 2, and 50 new streaming recordings in the Palabra Archive. We are recording this National Hispanic Heritage Month event on Indigenous Peoples Day from several states. I am in Maryland within the DC metro area, which also includes parts of Virginia. Our panel joins us from Illinois, California, Massachusetts, Vermont, and Utah. Our partners are participating from Louisiana and Tennessee. Together, we want to recognize Indigenous presence in our everyday lives and take a moment to consider what it means to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant communities who make their homes in these locations and others today. We gather from the traditional territories of many peoples, including, but not limited to, the Naconstink, Anacostan, Piscataway, Pamunkey, Nentego, Matapuni, Chickahominy, Monacan, Powhatan, Peoria, Kaskaskia, Ho-Chunk, Miamia, Kickapoo, Powhatomi, Chochenyo, Ramaitash, Ohlone, Pennacook, Massachusetts, Abenaki, Wabanaki, Ute, Acolipsia, Bayagula, Chitamacha, Choctaw, Homa, Tunica, Cherokee, and Shawnee peoples. Please enjoy this conversation this evening and accept my invitation to look for connections between the past and present and between communities, books, and your homes. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn over the microphone and the camera to Denise Woltering and Colleen McCoy. Thank you all for joining us.
First, thank you so much to Suzanne Shadle, Danny Thurber, Liliana Lopez, and the Hispanic Reading Room at the Library of Congress. The Americas Award is so grateful for its longstanding partnership with the Library of Congress and the chance to work together on programs just like this one. The Americas Award was founded in 1993 by Julie Klein at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and since then has recognized hundreds of exemplary children's and young adult books that authentically and engagingly portray Latin America, the Caribbean, and Latinx culture in the United States. Among other criteria, review committee members place specific emphasis on a book's potential for classroom use, making the Americas Award a fantastic resource for teachers and librarians. The Americas Award is sponsored by the Consortium of Latin American Studies programs and is coordinated by Tulane University's Stone Center for Latin American Studies and Vanderbilt University Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies.
I would like to share a special thanks to our 2021 committee members for this year's awards that they've recognized: Pat Austin, Christy Moraga, Melinda Gandara, Lou Marzulli, and Danny Thurber. Generous support for this program is also provided by Florida International University, Stanford University, The Ohio State University, UNC Duke Consortium in Latin American and Caribbean Studies, University of Florida, University of New Mexico, University of Texas at Austin, University of Utah, and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. We encourage you to visit the webpage claspprograms.org/America's Award, which I'll drop in the chat box in a moment. Please visit our site to explore related curricular resources and to learn more about the award itself. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, our amazing moderator for the evening, Dr. Ruth Kidoa, former America's Award Committee member and Associate Professor of Reading and Language at National Louis University, also a former kindergarten and bilingual second grade teacher. She teaches master's level courses in youth literature, comprehension, teaching writing, and pre-service literacy methods, as well as doctoral courses in comprehension and diverse youth literature. Her research focuses on picture books and the politics of aesthetics and the impact of BIPOC literature on K-12 teachers' instructional practices. Other research areas include trends and issues of Latinx-themed youth literature published in the United States, international Spanish language youth literature, and wordless picture books. I hand it over to you, Ruth.
Thank you. Hello, and welcome to the celebration. This is a celebration of children's and young adult Latin American and Latinx literature. As I introduce our panel of authors and illustrators, I'll be starting with those who created the primary level books recognized by the America's Award, followed by those of the secondary titles. So Angela Burke-Kunkel, can you wave? There you go. I like this on your website. You're a librarian by day and an author by night, and formerly worked with all kinds of readers as an English language arts teacher in both Massachusetts and New Mexico. She now lives in Vermont with her husband, 2 children, 2 dogs, 2 guinea pigs, and a bearded dragon. Her 2021 America's Award-winning title for primary readers, the picture book biography titled Digging for Words, Jose Alberto Gutierrez and the Library He Built, illustrated by Paula Escobar, was her debut book for children, which I didn't know until I researched. This book, set in Bogota, Colombia, and more specifically in the barrio of La Nueva Gloria, tells the tale of 2 Jose's, a man who's a garbage collector and picks up trash in wealthy neighborhoods, rescuing all the books, and the other, a young boy who cannot wait until Saturday because that is the day he and the other children can visit Senor Jose's home and look at his books and borrow them from the many towering stacks of titles, all that were rescued from the trash. Raul III, or Raul Gonzalez III, I learned, is the author and illustrator of the America's 2021 honor book for primary readers, Vamos, Let's Go Eat. He currently lives in, and did you wave? You have to wave. He currently lives in Boston, although his work focuses on contemporary Mexican-American experiences and his own autobiographical memories of growing up in El Paso, Texas, and La Ciudad Juárez in Mexico. For example, the Mercado de, see if I get it right, Cuauhtémoc in Vamos, Let's Go to the Market, was modeled on the market in Ciudad Juárez. He knew this market really well, he probably still does, because his mother and 2 brothers went there often with the rest of the family to work with his family there. He has said that when you are working hard at the market, you get really hungry by afternoon, which makes sense because the second book, Vamos, Let's Go Eat, is all about eating really great Mexican food. And I'm excited to hear about your research process with that one. Something interesting I learned about Raul in my research is that he first came across comic style art when he found it at the 7-Eleven store because his father sent him there on Sundays to get the Sunday paper. And then when he was 15, he started working at Bills, Coins, Cards, Stamps, and Comics, where there were more comics. And he started to become interested in a greater variety of art than just superheroes. In fact, I found that you were a bit obsessed with copying and drawing comics during all these years. And I loved your Lowrider series. So I'm excited to hear you talk about the Vamos series today. And then for our secondary books, Aida Salazar, who is, and go ahead and wave. There you go. Who is the author of the Americas 2021 award book for secondary readers titled Land of the Cranes, has published many other award-winning books and short stories, all of which explore topics of identity and social justice. Born in Mexico, Aida grew up in Southeast Los Angeles with her 6 other siblings. She has an MFA in writing from the California Institute of Arts and now lives in a teal-colored house in Oakland with her husband, who is a Latin jazz musician, 2 artist teams that she homeschooled through elementary school. Aida has also taught visual arts, poetry, and fictions to students of all ages and is an arts activist, producing festivals, other events, protests, artist residencies, and conferences. I'm excited to hear the backstory for Land of Cranes today, a story about a little girl and her pregnant mother who are caged in a U.S. immigration detention facility. And finally, Jamila Said Mendez is the author of Furia, a young adult novel about a soccer star who happens to be a teenage girl, who happens to live in a family where this is not a thing girls do, although it is perfectly fine for her superstar futbolero brother. Originally from Argentina, Jamila came to the United States to study something practical at Brigham Young University, like international economics, after which she worked as a translator, but just could not escape her lifelong desire and need to write. An MFA at Vermont's College's Writing for Children and Young Adults program, and she's been off ever since writing. One of Jamila's quotes that really stood out to me as I was researching all of you today, and I'm going to end here with this and maybe have it help frame our conversation today. Jamila, in one of the interviews, you said, writing is a revolutionary act in itself, especially for members of marginalized communities who have sometimes been incorrectly labeled voiceless through the years. We have a voice, and traditionally marginalized authors have been writing for a long time. The stories they created paved the way for me and authors like me to tell our stories today. Not only stories of resistance and oppression, but also of joy and fulfillment, of victory and love, which are revolutionary concepts too. The mind can change when exposed to different ideas and worldviews. And as an author, I recognize the power and responsibility I have to be as authentic as possible in every word attributed to me. And I think that's why a lot of us are here today, for that very reason. Maybe there's teachers who have to do it subversively. There's others who have the power to bring in books. And so now we get to move to the part where you all get to share your stories. And I really liked, Jamila, you covered everything from the victory and the joy to the resistance and oppression. So my first question, and I'll ask Jamila to start our conversation, is why this story? Why this story at this time, Furia? In other words, why is your book's theme, protagonist, plot, and or their life important to share with readers today? Take it away.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for this introduction. And again, I am so happy and honored to be here sharing this space with my esteemed colleagues whom I admire so much. And I started writing Furia a long time ago, before when I was the mom of 4 young children. I wasn't 30 yet, and I would just write during nap times and at bedtime, a story that was just in my heart. Although Furia is not my first published novel, it was the first story that I attempted to write, even when I didn't know what I was doing. They didn't teach me how to write in my economics program in college. But I've always been a reader, and I had a goal. I started writing this story for myself because I was very homesick. I hadn't been home in Argentina for a long time. And I remember going to writers' workshops, and one of the one piece of advice that I would hear over and over was to write what was in my heart, to be authentic. And what I had in my heart was Rosario and soccer, which I love. I am an unrepentant, obsessive person when it comes to soccer or football, how we call it. Rosario is the cradle of a lot of very famous players like Leo Messi, Angel Di Maria, all players that are all have one thing in common. They're all men. But I grew up watching women playing, and I was a fan of the sport ever since I was a little girl. And Furia is not only about soccer, it's the story of Camila, who has this passion, but it's also told with the backdrop of the Ni Una Menos movement that started in Latin America in 2014, which was after I had started writing Furia. But this topic of violence against women and equal rights was a conversation already happening when I was a child in Argentina. And it's kind of sad that these topics of violence and inequality continued into my adulthood. And even though I started writing this story a long time ago, they're still very valid themes and very, we see them in the news every day. And although the story takes place in Rosario, Argentina, Argentina doesn't have a monopoly on these issues. These are problems that we see all over the world, and yes, even here in the US. And so although it's the journey to publication for Furia took a long time, the topics were very valid and timely still. And so it also happened that the market was a little more ready to have a story with I know we will talk about titles later, but with a title in Spanish, with a brown Argentine girl on the cover. I was more open to this kind of stories than it was 10 years ago when I started this journey.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And Angela?
Thank you, Ruth. I just want to echo what Yomili said for welcoming us and for this honor and to be in such amazing company. In terms of this story at this time, you had such a great introduction to Digging for Words, but I have worked as a school librarian since 2011. And at the time that I began working on this story in early 2017, I was working in Albuquerque, New Mexico at Truman Middle School, which has a well-recognized dual education program. The school population is, 98% Latinx and 100% free and reduced lunch. And so much of my role was outreach to communities and getting families to, use the library and access the services that we offered and getting kids excited about reading, which I think is what Jose did in his community in a really beautiful way. So one fact that just captured my attention when I first encountered his story was that Bogota is a city of 10 million people with 19 public libraries, and there wasn't one in La Nueva Gloria until he started his library from discarded books. So opening his doors to children was just something that I really connected with, and the importance of the work that so many of us do as educators or librarians or authors is getting children excited about reading and books. And the way that he did that really captured my attention.
Thank you. And you, Aida?
So Land of the Cranes came during a time when the Trump administration was recently installed, and they were going after sanctuary cities and states pretty aggressively. I live in California, in Northern California, and there were people really fearful. There was a kind of a sense of terror that my community was experiencing. And when I say my community, I'm talking about the undocumented and formerly undocumented community. I was born in Mexico and brought over when I was 9 months old, and I lived undocumented my whole childhood until I was about 13 years old. So our community was under siege. They were picking up people off the street on their way to take their children to school. At one point, ICE alerted the mayor of Oakland, where I live, that they were going to be doing a massive raid in the Bay Area, in the East Bay. And she turned around and alerted the community, and it was all over the Spanish language media, and everybody was really terrorized. And despite the mayor's warnings, which were later, she was later attacked for those warnings. And despite those warnings, they rounded up about 300 people, undocumented people, during that day, on that one day. And they took them from work, bending off the street, whatever. And there was also something else that was happening. People were getting chased. There was a couple, a husband and wife, who were on their way. They were farm workers in the Central Valley, on their way to work to pick in the fields. And they were chased. They crashed and died in that crash. They left behind 6 US born children, orphans. And so these were the kind of stories that were kind of whirring around, and it was in that environment, and because of my history, that I wrote Land of the Cranes. I wrote it in part because of that kind of sense of fear that our communities were enduring, but also because the muse is what it is, and I'm an artist and a writer, and I opened myself up one day as I was studying other work, and my pen just wrote the word deportation, and like in the next hour and a half, I sat down and wrote the first 30 pages of this story. And it was as if this little spirit, was there in the room and was telling me that she liked chocolate milk, and that they were undocumented, and that she had a papi and a mommy, and Miss Martinez, her teacher. And so all of this kind of came flooding out. And by the end of the week, I had the full synopsis written, and I was just awash in tears, because the story was so tragic. It was not my story. It was a collective story from my community, but it was something that needed to be told for my community. So that wasn't around February of 2019. The book sold on proposal and 50 pages. And in June of 2019, that's when we saw the zero tolerance policy kind of displayed, and all the world's eyes turned their attention to that moment, to that tragedy. And it was, I only changed a little bit of the story in response to that, but more than anything, I was able to kind of really take from the incredible work of journalists who were sharing their stories of more details about what it was like to be inside detention. So it was urgent. It was urgent to tell.
Right. Very timely. Thank you. And now we'll turn to Raul. Why your book? Why now?
Well, honestly, I almost feel like this kind of book should have been around for decades, because my family on the border and in Mexico and in Juarez, they've been creating magic there for as far back as I can remember, and as far back as they can remember. And as a little boy growing up in both Juarez and in El Paso, I was fascinated by all things having to do with cartoons and animation, as well as the power in pop culture symbology on both sides, whether it was El Chavo del Ocho or knockoff piñatas that my abuelito would make to sell, whether it was E.T. or whatever popular character, my abuelito would make a piñata of it. And so as an adult, living most of my life here in the Boston area, I kept wondering why there wasn't a cartoon universe that was set in the magical border town that I grew up in. I'd seen them in New York and California, but never in El Paso and Juarez. And so another thing is I living here in Boston, I was also an instructor. I taught after school art classes, museum classes, and I would notice that kids from incredibly rich cultures, whenever we would begin design your own character exercise, they never created characters that were a reflection of their own stories, their own histories, or the way that they looked. They always chose, the white superheroes, and they began to create white superheroes. And so I realized that I was very similar. The characters that I created as a kid were, like you mentioned, Ruth, were simply copies of pre-existing characters. And so in my 20s, I started to really create work that was more a reflection of myself and my own personal history and heritage. And when with the Vamos series, I really just wanted to create a world that was a wonderful introduction to all of the cool things that I have been inspired by since I was a little kid. And I will say that creating each and every one of these books is not difficult for me because the source material is so incredibly rich and fun and exciting. And the world of Vamos is not just a celebration, but it's also a love letter to the part of the country that I grew up in. And through it, and when I visit schools, I was just in Midland, Texas last week. I want to show kids that they should be incredibly proud of where they're from and the language that their parents speak. And also that there is value in their personal stories and where they're from. And so Little Lobo, Kuki Duki, Cocorocho, La Oink Oink El Toro, and everybody else helps me show this. Wait, what a second. Was I muted this whole time? Darn it.
I was, so I couldn't come right back in because I wasn't sure when you
I could not have that again.
And just the layers of meaning in your images and the cultural reference you make for kids who know who Chavo del Ocho is, with the and just and the foods, and it's just this rich, joyous life that's been there forever, like you said, and yet there's this wall that this literal wall that you cannot take away the life that is borderless.
Yes, I'm really excited that my book, which comes out tomorrow,
we get to
all
see
about
it.
a celebration in between two lands. Vamos, let's cross the bridge.
Oh, that's so exciting. Yay. I'm gonna have to find it right away. So now we want to know the next thing that I'm curious about is when you're conceptualizing, all of you, when you're conceptualizing and drafting titles, who do you envision? Because I've read some titles where I can see they're supposed to be for children who aren't Latino. And my daughter, when she was 4, she's all grown up now. I was reading her a book with a little a phrase in Spanish, and then there was a said papa, and then there was a translation in English, and her 4-year-old self was irate with me, and she got off the couch and she put her hands on her hips and said, "Why did you do that?" And I said, "Do what?" And she said, "Tell me what it means." I said, "I didn't do that. That's the way the book was made." And I can still see this today, and it's 20 some years later. She said, "Don't they know I already know what that means?" And so I'm curious because, sometimes you have to have a certain audience or your editor. I don't know the process for any of that, but when you're conceptualizing, who are your readers? Who are you talking to when you're drawing or when you're writing? There's some books that are so wonderful as are yours. But I'm curious what goes on in your head when you're thinking about that reader or that viewer of the visual narrative out there. So this time we will start with Raul. We'll go back to you and start over again. You get to keep going.
Well, that is an interesting question. And obviously, you know, I do have my readers in mind when I am creating these books, but simultaneously, I would say that one of the more important readers that I have in mind, and might be a little selfish, but it's myself as a little kid, and the kind of books that I was searching for, and I do remember specifically going to a bookshelf or going to a comic book stand, hoping to find this book about the area that I was living in, and hoping to find it on the bookshelf. And
yeah,
that was kind of difficult. And so this cartoon universe that I have created is something that I created as a gift, not just to a younger version of myself, but also as a gift to young Latinx boys and girls who are seeing themselves in these drawings and in these stories, but also their parents who are looking at these books and understanding that these books were made by someone who is just like them. And I also, you know, in one of my deepest desires is, as a kid, there weren't a lot of people like me or my other amazing colleagues on board today that my parents could look up to and say, well, if they could do it, then mijo might actually stand a chance at becoming an artist. And so becoming an artist was never in their wheelhouse. They never thought that I could ever possibly make a living. And so when I make these books with Vamos a cruzar el puente, a comer, a visitar el mercado, I do it so that parents could also say, wow, this guy's making stories about what it's like to be a Mexican living on the frontera. Or maybe maybe mijo or mija could one day do the same exact thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So those are all little items on my wish list.
Oh, that's neat. That's neat. Touched my heart. Thank you. And Angela, what about you?
I think with digging for words with this particular book, it was my students in Albuquerque, and you know, loving that job and knowing that for a lot of them, the school library was their main point of access for, you know, getting those stories where either they saw themselves represented in certain books, or if they just wanted, you know, a complete escape to experience, you know, when they dove into those pages. So video footage of Jose's library, a lot of it is really wonderful because it shows, you know, children going into his library and looking through the stacks of books and pulling out things they're excited about. And I think for anybody who works with children in that way, like, you know, that moment where that child finds that book that they want to take home and they want to read. And so I think that connection between seeing footage of children in Bogota in his library and doing that as a career, I just I had that same excitement reflected in seeing students find that book, and so I had those students in mind in terms of like showing what that space means to people and the possibilities that are there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. What about you, Aida?
So the title for Land of the Cranes is a direct translation of the word Aslan. And Aslan means land of the cranes, but it's also the mythological homeland of the Aztecs, the Mexica people. And it's a myth that said that the Aztecs descended from a place in the southwestern United States called Aslan, land of the cranes, and that they were to travel south until they saw an eagle devouring a surface on a cactus, where they found their great city of Tenochtitlan. The myth says that one day the people would return to Aztlan to live among the cranes. So it's a metaphor. It's art. The whole myth is very argued by historians and linguists and activists. But it to me was such a perfect metaphor to talk about migration, to talk about what it is when we cage people for trying to do as all migratory animals and creatures on this planet do, which is look for safety, look out for their well-being, for shelter, for food, for safety. So it really made it so that I could talk about this very difficult and very tragic and barbaric thing happening in the world, the criminalization of people who migrate and the caging of people who migrate in a way that was beautiful and understandable to children. And the the Puerto Rican poet Piri Thomas said, "Every child is born a poet." And when I write in poetry for readers, all readers, mostly Latinx children, I write, and I'm kind of writing to that sensibility about them, that they are poets and they understand the world in these very strange and beautiful ways, and they express themselves in language that's very creative and very fresh and new and inventive. And so I'm kind of trying to appeal to that sensibility about them and allow them to allow them to understand really difficult concepts and real world concepts in a way that is not going to turn them off, but really kind of allow them to get it. So it's the power of metaphor, right? So,
Right,
so definitely that's what's at the center of it.
Poetry too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you. Jamile?
Well, I'm going to echo their words, because at first my target audience was the child that I was a long time ago. I grew up in Argentina, so unlike a lot of Latina authors who were born or grew up in the United States, I did see myself in the art produced by my country people. Argentina has a very rich tradition of literature, children's literature especially. And I grew up reading the works of Alma Maritano, Maria Elena Walsh, Paula de Retach, authors who are not even translated into English, sadly, but they're well known all over Latin America and who have made their mark. And every little nursery aged child knows the songs of Maria Elena. So I was very inspired by them. But although I did see my culture, I also didn't see a part of my identity in the books that I read, because sometimes the stories that I was exposed to showed a type of society that was very different from mine. I grew up in a very humble home, and the media that we get from Argentina sometimes is the white European part of the population. So I wanted to show in Furia what rich heritage my country has. I, like Camila, my character, I come from a multicultural, multiracial family with branches and roots from all over the world. My name is Arabic, said with a Spanish accent. I have a great-grandmother who was from Yugoslavia, and she immigrated to Argentina with an Italian passport. So I wanted to show that it's not as we see it sometimes on TV, on the media that we get. And then my desire evolved to want to show my children. I mentioned that they were very little when I started writing, and one of them didn't even exist by then, my little one. And so I wanted to show not only the hard parts of growing up in Rosario, Argentina, but also the beauty of it. And I understood that it was a very fine line to walk. I didn't want to paint the place that I love so much in rose-colored through, show it through rose-colored glasses, but show the reality of what it was. And I was conscious all the time that I was telling a story in a language that is not the language that in which I grew up. And so I had to write in English and trying to give the impression that everybody in my story was speaking Spanish. So when I heard the news that Furia was going to be translated into Spanish, that was perhaps one of the greatest moments of my life, even more than when I found out that it was finally going to be published, because my one target audience, which is a girl from a barrio in Rosario, would be able to read the book in Spanish. So I believe that through different parts of the process, the target audience in my mind kept changing. But the main thing is not only for girls to read Furia and have an understanding of what it's like to want to do something that is forbidden by society or your family, but also wanted to show men and boys what it's like to be a girl growing up, a Latina girl growing up in this world. And I've been very heartened and touched and moved by the messages that I've received from the readers.
Have you gone back and seen if your book is on the shelves of El Ateneo or some of the other bookstores yet?
I have not been in Argentina.
I'd like to see it up there on the.
I know. El Ateneo is one of my most favorite places in the world. But I did go to Argentina for the last time in December of 2019 when I was working through the very last revision of Furia. And so my book was due for final edits about a week after I came back home. And so I poured all of the fresh experiences that I had into that last polish, and hopefully soon I'll get to go back and sit there.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I hope it takes place of the Disney that sometimes creeps us across.
Yes.
Yes.
No, and like Raul was saying, that sometimes a lot of the literature, I mean, Argentina has a rich tradition of literature, but when I go and look at the shelves, I see a lot of translated works from the United States, which is awesome. But these are, of course, the super bestsellers. And then the work that gets produced, it's kind of like a copy of those stories that come from the US, instead of being original stories that show what it's like to grow up in Argentina. Right. So I know there are authors who are doing the work, but it's hard. It's hard to share the stories.
Yes. Well, thank you. So I'd like to hear more about your research process. As you were writing or illustrating this title. And so Aida, since you've just been sharing, can you share for us first, you said it came to you. So did you have to do any sort of other type of research when you were writing? You've already described your process a little bit.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I used, I mentioned earlier that I used the information that was gathered by the journalists. I spoke to immigration attorneys, to immigration journalists, and there are a few immigration journalists who are very conscientious of not creating trauma porn, as they call it, and showing the migrant experience is just one of victimhood. And so I only use their work because they had this consciousness about making sure that people were shown with dignity and agency. But I didn't interview any children myself because the trauma was so severe, and I'm not a trained therapist. And I didn't feel qualified, and I didn't feel, right, interviewing children to re-traumatize or to talk to them about their experiences. So I didn't, but I didn't have to go very far to know what it was, to learn what it was like to be in detention from my own family, because I have family members who have been deported. I have family members who crossed the border and were never heard from again. I know what it's like to cross the border as somebody who's undocumented, and not telling the truth about what my status was. So the fear and the living in the shadows and that whole part of being othered was lived in many ways, but being inside a detention center, no. And I would say also, so inside the detention center, the mother gets sick. And my mom was dying at the time. She was battling cancer. And so all of that kind of loss and longing for mother, and knowing that there was going to be a separation was an emotional kind of it was an emotional truth that I was speaking to in the book. So research from the heart and a little bit on the outside.
Right. But still truth, right? Yeah, still truth. Thank you. Raul, I saw that you did some art in restaurants.
Yeah, that's right. That is correct.
Is that part of your research process every time, or do you?
Well, no, but I am a self-taught artist, and so a lot of the ways that I made inroads into the art world and then the publishing world happened in maybe not a way that a trained artist or author might make it. And so I started out here in the Boston area, just trying to figure out a way to make a living. And one thing that I did, my dad was a door-to-door salesman. And so I picked up a lot of tips from him. And obviously he would tell me to knock on doors. And so I remember being that I was Mexican, I would go to Mexican restaurants in the South End of Boston, and then Somerville and Cambridge, Brookline. And I would look at their menu and I would say, hey, I can draw a much better menu for you. And so there's about 5 or 6 restaurants in the Boston area that not just showcase my menu designs, but also later it went to designing the entire visual look of a restaurant. So if you come to Boston, you'll go to the Painted Burro or 2 Burro bars. And to this day, I can still go in now, I can still go in and get free food. So it's pretty fantastic. And so for research for Vamos is interesting. And I love doing the research because the Vamos books are, at least the first 3, have been taken from very close personal experiences. So the first book, Vamos, Let's Go to the Market, is basically a story about me and my brothers visiting El Mercado Cuauhtémoc. And we went to the Mercado Cuauhtémoc because my mom and her family moved from El DF, and they helped found the Mercado. They, had booths, and everyone in the family sold something different. And so the first book is all about all of the different mercancía that my family sells, everything from dulce to yerbería, all sorts of fun stuff, piñata, cintos, all sorts of, things that I knew would be just very visually captivating. And for some research, since I've been away for 20 years, I had my prima, and my entire family's still there, send me tons of pictures of all of the merchandise that they were still selling. And believe it or not, it's pretty much the same stuff, except the piñatas, instead of E.T. the extraterrestrial, it's SpongeBob or, stuff like that. And as for Vamos, Let's Go Eat, it's as simple as just going back home and eating my mom's amazing cooking, as well as going to the mercado and visiting the basement and going to eat flautas and tortas at Tortas Nico and you name it. That was a really fun part of the research. And of course, delving in just a little deeper to understand how a food truck works, because there's a lot of food trucks in this book, and also ingredients that are used in preparation of these delicious plates. But simultaneously, there's one booth that one food maker that I really love, and it's based on a trip that I made to Los Angeles. And my friend Mario Ibarra from Los Angeles, he's an amazing artist and has a great art center called Slangwich in LA. And he took me on what he called the ghetto tour of LA. And then he took me, he's like, dude, you got to try these. And I'd never had them before, but it was an amazing, it was a Korean taco, and it was made by Chef Roy Joy, I believe his name was, no me acuerdo al momento. But what I loved about it and why I included it in this book, along with pupusas, because I never had those either, because those are from El Salvador, was how just naturally we all influence each other, and we all bring something to the table, and through that we create something very beautiful, and in this case quite tasty. Oh.
Good, thank you. Let's see, who is next on my list? I lost my space. I was taking someone as Jamile. I think it was you. What is your process to write or illustrate? I know you talked about writing during nap times.
Yes.
So
yes.
as children might be evolving out of nap times, has that changed, or are they still in nap times?
No. My youngest is 9 years old. So now the school time is my sacred writing time. I cannot do the late shifts anymore with teenagers who have to get up so early. But right. I feel like I researched for this book for my whole life. I remember being a very young child and making the conscious decision of learning the rules of football and soccer, because I knew even I couldn't have been older than 10 years old. I knew that if I didn't like it, I was going to be miserable all my life, because everything in my family revolved around football and soccer. And so I'm obsessive, like I said, about the sport. I've learned about the history of it, and with the magic and of the internet. Now I can read archived articles from the women who played the first World Cup in Mexico in 1971, these abuelas rebeldes who were the pioneers of the sport, and them, the people of their generation made it possible for the US national team today to have all these championships and Olympic medals. And I read a book that it was so, I mean, it's amazing how synchronicity works, because as I was doing my revisions of Foodie, I came across a book called Futbolera, A History of Women and Sports in Latin America by Brenda Elsie and Joshua Nadell. And it talks about how the sport evolved in Latin America and what it means. And I learned how women, how it was illegal even 50 years ago for women to play soccer in Brazil and Argentina. They would go to jail, and they were only relegated to playing in the circus, dressed as men, or like I did growing up, only with my family or my friends. So also part of my research was playing soccer myself. I never got to play in a team, but every time I go back to Argentina, I get together with my high school friends there. I went to the same school all my life, and these girls, these women now, middle-aged women, we got together every time I've been back to play. And of course, the body can't do what it could do 20 years ago, but we still have fun together. And I follow the sport, and I follow the now something that is amazing to me. Growing up, I didn't know about these abuelas rebeldes. I learned their names later on, but now the names of the women who are the face of women's soccer are pretty much household names. Everybody knows about Alex Morgan and Meg Rapinoe, and even players from other countries, and that was not something that was common knowledge when I was growing up. So it always makes me excited for the future, to know that things have changed so much in these last few years, and I'm excited to see what the future will be like for the next generations. And so the research was fun. It was sometimes heartbreaking when I had to go and look into the names of the girls and women who disappear, but it was also rewarding to know that they're not forgotten, that even not only in my book, but that people still know about these girls and women who have disappeared and have marked our Argentine society.
Right. During that difficult time. Yeah. Just to mention, Meg Rapinoe has an autobiography out this year for young adults. So have you seen it?
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead. And Angela, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I also need to mention that Roy Choi, who makes the Korean tacos, has a picture book biography. I think it's called Street Food Remix. Yeah.
And it's illustrated by a graffiti artist named Man One. Really cool guy.
Yes.
Right. Is that with the Readers to Eaters publishing company, I think? Yeah.
I remember the publishing company. But it picture book biographies, it's an approach where you want to make sure that you're honoring the person and telling their story accurately, and also dealing with some limitations in terms of research sometimes. So I first encountered Jose's story through like a 3-minute video on social media, which cannot give you a complete picture of someone's life or their project. And that video was produced by AJ Plus, which is the social media arm of Al Jazeera. So thankfully that helped me track back to a long form article in Al Jazeera by a journalist named Simitri Daniel, who was a Gabriela Garcia Marquez fellow in Colombia doing journalistic work in Colombia, and covered Jose and his library in a very detailed article. And from there, it was really important to me to do research in both English and Spanish, and to go to the earliest articles in El Tiempo, the major newspaper in Bogota, and read the earliest coverage of why he started it and what it meant to people in his community and to him to have that space. And thankfully for YouTube, which is an amazing resource in terms of finding video footage of news interviews and things like that, and watching every interview he gave with local news sources. And then I'm really, really grateful to Dr. Christina Lyons, who's a Latin American studies and anthropology professor who does a lot of work in Colombian communities, because she was able to connect Jose and I so that he could read a draft of the story before I started querying agents and sending it out, so that he could see how his story was being conveyed. And then I had to make the decision in terms of feeling that the audience was children, and those children in his library were such an important part of the story, to create that second invented character. The child Jose in the book is not one specific character that's true to life. It's more a combination of any child who could enter his library, but that character needed to be there in order to make the story accessible to children, I guess is what I would say. So making those kind of craft decisions while doing the research was kind of a balancing act.
Right, but what a mentor text too for kids, that they can look at and say, oh, two perspectives going on here, whether in a visual narrative like Raul does, or in a written narrative. So that's really neat. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. So my next question is, and I'm going to switch it a little bit. The original question that you received was, what part of the story, if any, was most difficult to write and or illustrate, and why? And if you feel like you might have already touched on that, you might want to change it to what was most fun as well. Because writing, even though it's an emotional topic, there's something about, getting it out there, and I don't know, besides seeing it in print. That's always the fun part, but the laborious part, what might have been fun for you or what was difficult. And so I'll start with Yamile.
Yes, the most difficult part of writing Furia was the ending for me, like the climax when Camila decides to go to the march because the sister of one of the girls from the team, the little sister, went missing, and then she was found dead, and so she joins this march, and it was very emotional for me to get myself into that moment, because I have been to these marches, and I know that sometimes when we see the news, there's just one more person that goes missing, but this person meant the world for a family, and all the feelings that just bubble to the surface to an event like this. I wanted to do it justice, and also not do it in a way that was, like Aida said, pain porn. I wanted to create consciousness that this is not a spectacle. But the most joyful parts of the book for me were the parts when she gets to play and she gets to do what she loves, with, like her coach says, with no expectations. And she just does what she does best because she loves it. And she has her community, and she feels invincible. And also the parts with the love interest, Diego, because I felt like you read in the little excerpt in your introduction, joy and love can be revolutionary concepts in our community sometimes. And Camila, who grows up in a very harsh environment, for her to find somebody who really loves her and respects her and supports her dreams, that's a treasure that she found, that she was lucky enough to find early in life. So I had a lot of fun writing the love story and writing about the soccer.
Did you dream you were playing soccer at night ever?
Yes, all the time.
You're so in it, yeah.
Yes.
I bet. That's really fun. Thank you so much. And Angela, what about you?
I'm going to say that the most fun piece and the most challenging piece are the same piece.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but it was, I think the fun was in the process. So when Digging for Words was acquired, and Ann Kelly, my editor at Random House, and I were going through revisions, one of the things that she requested is, can you show a little bit more about books that were meaningful to Jose and that experience? And at first, I was not really sure how to do that without it sounding like a book report. Or, the novels that were most meaningful for him were pretty, adult works of heavy literature. So Anna Karenina or 100 Years of Solitude. And it was really difficult to wrap my head around at first. And then I realized, because I'm an author, I'm not an author illustrator like Raul, that you leave room for your illustrator. And you just show, the experience of reading, but you don't need to tell every single thing about those books that were meaningful to him. So Paula did just such a beautiful job of, taking one or two details in a sentence. And for 100 Years of Solitude, she has Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Yellow Butterflies all over the page, which is something I never would have imagined, because she's the visual thinker and the artist. Or, showing the scenes from Anna Karenina surrounding Jose as he's leaning against a garbage can with a stack of books reading. And the cover in her illustration is the real cover of the very first book he found. So finding those details from my research, sharing them and weaving them in, the collaborative process with an illustrator is just so much fun once you realize how to get there.
And the illustrations in that book are magnificent.
She did an incredible job.
I was sorry she couldn't be here today. So yeah, thank you for sharing a little bit about her. I was going to ask you that at the beginning, if you knew anything to share that part too. So thank you so much. And let's see. And Raul, you haven't shared yet. Would you share with us?
Well, it's funny because since Vamos, Let's Go Eat, I have written and illustrated 5 books and just illustrated 2 more. So that's a total of 7 since then. So it's kind of hard to like remember exactly what I was going through at the time. But I will say that I mainly have fun more than I than I struggle with the creation of these books. But one thing that I loved about Vamos, Let's Go Eat, that was different than Vamos, Let's Go to the Market, is that when I started working on Vamos, Let's Go Eat, I knew that the series had expanded from just 2 books all the way up to 10.
Oh.
And so that meant that I could have a great time really exploring the personalities of some of the characters and bring out characters that I wanted to make the flagship characters in the series, and also put a spotlight on characters that were going to be spinning off into their own titles as the world of Vamos expanded. And so it was a lot of fun to just kind of think about the entirety of the world of Vamos as I worked on this one particular volume. So yeah, it was fun, and it is obviously always challenging because any drawing a spread could take anywhere from 24 hours to 40 hours to complete, and so it does take a lot of focus, but it's something that I've been training to do since I was a little kid, so it's fun. I really enjoy it.
Yeah, it's like creating, fantasy writers have to create the backstory and the lighting and where everything comes from. And to think about, you were able to create this, whole world.
Yeah.
That's real and yet not. That's
yeah. And also during the making of book number 2, I also found out that we were going to be adapting it into a television series, and so it added an extra layer of development.
Right, because then you have to. That's sort of a 3D thing. Kind of blows my mind a little bit to think about today, but that's exciting. So you're creating within a world that's becoming sort of 3D, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's neat. Congratulations. That's exciting. It's very exciting. And what about you?
Wow. Well, it's a difficult story. It was so difficult to write. As I mentioned earlier, I cried through a lot of it. It was what kind of helped me regulate my emotions as I was as I was drafting it. My husband would walk into the room and he'd see me just bawling, and he'd say, "What happened?" I'm like, "Betita, it's Betita's, this is what's happening at this moment for her." And because my mom was sick, the moment when her mother is having preterm labor and is taken away, that moment was really, really difficult to write. And the moments when, her best friend inside the detention center confides in her that she's been molested, that was also a very difficult passage to write.
Yeah, I can imagine, because the best friend was relating something that Betita might not have even completely understood.
Mm-hmm.
And that to do that in the way you did it, literary, it was beautiful. The reality of it wasn't. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, that was a very I had to be really careful about how that was delivered. And because I think as children's book authors, we have this kind of unspoken Hippocratic oath to do no harm. And while it's important to point to the wound and the truth of that wound, it's also important to take care of our readers and to make sure that we're telling the truth without triggering or creating further harm. So that was, I think, one of the most difficult. And then one of the kind of most healing moments was when Betita, the little girl, receives a package of drawings and poems from her father, picture poems from her father, and a letter. And every time I read that letter, even now, I start to cry. And then I'm not crying because, I mean, it's painful, and it was painful to write, but I cry because it was a moment of healing for my character, and it kind of really gets to the heart of why so many parents take that risk to come to a new country with their small children, and it explains the fight for freedom, and the struggle for freedom. And so that was like very joyful, but I'll end by saying that the most wonderful poem to write in the entire book was this poem called Jelly Ranchera Strides. And Betita is waking up in East LA. Her bedroom is a converted laundry room, and her dad's put up Christmas lights in there, and it's like a little duplex. And she gets up, and her mom's making breakfast, and the rancheras are coming, the music's coming in from outside, the neighborhood is popping, car wash rituals, all sorts of things are happening in the neighborhood. And her parents start dancing rancheras, and she gets pulled into the dance, and she's putting her face on her mama's panza, and they're dancing, and it's just in the kitchen, which was one of something that I remember experiencing as a child, dancing between my parents while they danced rancheras. So very joyful and very, very satisfying to write. So
Thank you. That's beautiful. We have a few questions in the chat, so I do want to mention, or in the Q&A, to our participants. In a few minutes here, we'll be taking some of your questions, and so do put them in the chat so we can have our panelists speak directly to what you're also interested in that isn't being covered or you'd like to know more about. Going back to the questions, could you describe? I know, Raul, that you're writing many of you, the books might be autobiographical, but is there a specific character in your book, may not be the primary character, but one that resonated most for you? And why might that be? We'll start with, some of you had fewer characters than others, but we'll start there. And if you kind of want to spiral off onto another topic you're interested in, feel free to do so. We'll start there with Angela.
Yeah, I don't think mine will be very long because I think I've kind of already touched on it, but I think what really resonated is that idea of book access and that goal of getting books to children. And I'm going to say that I resonated a little bit with both the real Jose and invented Jose, and just loving stories and wanting to share them with other people. But
as a librarian, of course.
Yeah.
Librarians, that's the passion, especially children's and young adult librarians. Where would we be without people? In my own life, I had a librarian that meant a great deal. So yeah.
I think a lot of us do. Yeah.
Hopefully. That's why we keep going, right? Yeah. Oh, thank you. And what about you, Aida?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure.
I read the Q&A and I wasn't sure if it was addressing one of these.
Yeah, which of the characters resonated most with you?
Okay, yes.
Now or because sometimes you're writing a child, but really you might be somebody else in the story. Does any of them resonate with you the most?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm a little bit of everybody. Betita is a poet, so I'm definitely, resonate with that. Her mother is a teacher, and I, as you mentioned, I homeschooled my children, and through the arts, I use the arts integration as a way to teach them. The father is a dreamer and believes in Mesoamerican myths, and that's pretty much, not pretty much, but that resonates with me. And there is this character, yellow hair, who is Latina, but she dyes her hair orange or yellow, and she kind of betrays. She's a guard. She's a prison guard, and she betrays the community. And that, I think, is also me in some ways. As I check my privileges, being able to be an educated, being able to be documented, not always being the most in allegiance with my community. For whatever reason, not because I don't want to, but because my privileges separate me from my community. So I'm a little bit of everything in that book.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's neat. That's really neat. And what about you, Shamila? I'm saying your name wrong. I know I am. Jamila.
Shamile.
Oh, I am saying it okay then. Jamila.
With a name there,
Got
yes.
it.
Very much like Aida said, I'm a little bit of everybody. Of course, I love soccer. I share that passion with Camila, but I grew up in very different circumstances. Although I set the book in a real neighborhood of housing, of government housing. 7 de Septiembre is the same place where I grew up, but our families were very, very different. I also did not ever date a professional soccer player, but in every other way, her passion for learning and for wanting to break the cycle in which many of the women of her family had been trapped in for generations. That is very, very true. And that was all drawn from true emotions and feelings that I had. But also, I want to believe that I would have been somebody in Camila's team with a little, like Aida also said, a little more privileges. I did have a very supportive mother, and who always believed in my dreams and even allowed me to go to school in the United States by myself when I was 19. My daughter is 19. I would not let her go to another country in which she knows nobody, but I'm grateful that my mom let me and she believed in me. But if there is one person in which I drew the most to create Camila, was my mom. She was not a soccer player, but she loved soccer. And she, like Camila, she taught at an orphanage, and she was very revolutionary in her thoughts. She kept her maiden name all her life, and even though she married when she was very, very young. And so I feel like there's a little bit of everybody that I planted in all the characters. Perhaps the one that I feel like I resonate the most is the little girls at the end of the book that go and cheer for their team at the stadium and the autograph for the autograph. Because I've been there. I'm not ashamed to be a fangirl when I see my favorite players. And in fact, if I ever saw my greatest idols, I think I would faint in front of them. I'm not ashamed to say that, but so I think I resonate a lot with them. Just to see these idols in real life is a wonderful experience.
Hey, that's great. Thank you. And Raul, what about you? You have a lot of characters in your book.
Yeah, I do. I have a lot of characters. Well, you know what I love about making these books is like how some of these characters like remind me of people that I've known in the past. So for instance, there's this character who keeps showing up in each and every one of the books, and his name is Papetro. Mm-hmm. And he's like this guy who walks around with a staff, and hanging from the staff are puppets. And when I was a little kid growing up, we would go to the mercado, and I would sit at my abuelita's puesto, and this little old man would hobble by, and he would come in, and he would wear layers of clothing, sarapes, he had a hat, he had huaraches on, and he would come in with his staff, and hanging from the staff were all sorts of puppets. And I remember he would sell his puppets outside of the mercado, but then at the end of the day, when he had leftovers, he would come in to my abuelita's puesto and try to sell her his remainders. And he always held a handkerchief to his mouth. So, and he would ask, he started to negotiate with my abuelita, and they'd go back and forth. And when he would remove the handkerchief, he had this gigantic piece of skin missing from his cheek, so you could see all of his back teeth. And I remember once upon a time, when I was an adult here in Boston, he was one of the first characters that I drew. And so I drew him with his cane and his puppets and the way he dressed and the piece of skin missing from his cheek. And I sent it to my mom, and I was like, "Oye, mamá, ¿cómo se llamaba ese señor?" And my mom was like, "Oh my God, I haven't thought about him for decades." And she's all, "Let me ask your tios and tias." My grandma and grandpa have passed away. "Let me ask them if they remember." And immediately everybody recognized who he was, and nobody had thought of him for 20 or 30 years. And so they couldn't remember his name. And unfortunately, this was before anyone had a phone. There were no pictures that existed of him. So suddenly it was like he was born again in these books. And it made me really think that I like to make artwork for perhaps people who had never considered themselves, never considered that they could possibly ever be characters in a fictional work of art, or seen themselves in works of art. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but those are the types of characters that I like to create. They are cartoon characters, but they are also people who really helped define and shape my imagination as an artist today.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to move into the question and answers from those viewing today. And the first one is, says a couple of panelists mentioned trauma porn or pain porn, and this implicit victimization associated with people in the stories. And the question is, how in a predominantly white, rural, conservative area, what sort of language and message could be used to best serve a younger population without regular exposure to difference? So possibly, I'm assuming maybe that the use of the word porn, not that we would use that probably with children, you know. I see your so, but how could this be expressed in a way maybe kids could understand? And just whoever wants to share.
Well, I'd like to speak to that. The writing of, or the revision of Land of the Cranes was written with an eye to do that. So this is written for 9-year-olds to understand a very difficult and complex situation. And so I wrote it with this consciousness to show, give this main character agency, so that she knew that through poetry and visual art she could voice and not be a victim, but an agent of change. And so so when you read this story in white spaces, predominantly white spaces, I would lean into that. I would lean into the example that Betita shows us, that she is not just a victim, but an agent of change herself. And that if she, in her most difficult and darkest hour can find a way through the arts to lift herself up and rise and raise her voice, then they can too. So that was my attempt.
Right. That makes sense. Anyone else have a thought?
Yeah, and sometimes I think we look too much into the differences, but the experiences that children from communities, like the Latino community, Black community, Native American, they're children, they're just children. And if we just look for the similarities instead of othering, instead of reading to find offense, I've heard people say, oh, if we share these books with children from rural, conservative communities, which is a whole other, topic of conversation in that phrase alone, then Caucasian children will feel bad. But what if we just read with an intention to grow compassion and grow bridges instead of walls to divide us? There's also a misconception that we don't exist in these rural communities, and we do. We're here. I live in a very rural community, and we are participants of this community, and we're as much members of this society as everybody else is here. And so I think we just need to perhaps change our point of view to be really inclusive instead of, looking for these divisions.
Right, I agree. Anyone else? And I guess I would also add on that books, even they can be windows, and where you can also see yourself in the child. Maybe the child is a poet, you're a poet, and to kind of allow you to enter a world where the child is a child like you, and has feelings like you, and to better understand that other and the relationship, because you are an other to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I agree. Let's see. Someone entered late, but they're really interested in, it's a really long question. The questions, it's sort of a vague questions about the relationship between the writing and the illustrating as the two exist together in the book. So some of you have books with smaller illustrations or none. And some of you, the illustrations have a visual narrative that expands on. And so she just wants to know a bit more about how that relationship works or how it comes about.
I can speak to that a little bit as someone who writes but doesn't illustrate, and Digging for Words is a picture book. I think it's important to leave space for the artwork, which tells, half the story, if not more, because that's what children are looking at as we're sharing those books with them. And I think it's incredibly important that Paula Escobar is Colombian and lives in Bogota and brought all of those wonderful details in her illustrations to really reflect La Nueva Gloria. And I think you write with the story in mind, and I think many of us picture the story in our head, but you give up that control to honor the illustrator and their vision and their talent. And so I would say if you're at the early phases of writing, it's okay not to worry about it and just to tell the story the best you can, because my favorite parts of Digging for Words are the collaborative pieces that I couldn't have predicted what they would have turned out like. So,
Raul, I know you've illustrated for others in the Lowrider series. How do you have anything to say along those lines?
Well, it is a collaborative process. I've been really fortunate in that a lot of the works that I have created with collaborators, Kathy Camper and specifically Kathy Camper and Jason Reynolds. These were projects that we created outside of the system. And so I was a big part of conceptualizing the visual look for both of these series. And so in a sense, as a illustrator for, these graphic novels, I almost feel like I am a director, in that I am directing performances from the characters, from based on the dialogue that the storyteller has given me. And then when it comes to the collaboration within a picture book, what I love, I worked with Matthew Ringler recently on Stroller Coaster, is the spareness of the text and how it really left it open to mine and my collaborator Elaine Bay's imagination to fill in the blanks with, what we ended up putting on the page. And like Angela was just saying, it's probably best not to worry too much about what the final image is going to be, because when you get to the point of creating the book, either an editor or the author themselves has chosen the illustrator because they want to work with them, as opposed to look over their shoulder as they create the work of art.
Right.
Which I don't want.
Right. No. No. So I see that we're sitting right at 6:30, or my time is 6:32. It's 7:32 on the East Coast, and we're supposed to be ending. And we have, yes, it's time to go to bed for some of you. It's quite late. I appreciate the time you've taken today. And not only that, but the giving of your hearts and your joy and your deep research and napping with your children while you write. And we do look forward to many more of these books. There was a question that I think I'll sort of end with, how to preserve the interest in children for their rich culture when it seems to have so many forces in the opposite directions. And I would say that you all keep publishing, getting it on those bookshelves, both in Argentina and here, so that we're seeing these books front and center everywhere. They're the first things that come up on the ads, not just because I'm into it, but I keep at it, even when it's hard and painful. I just encourage you to keep at it, because it's such an inspiration to me, to my colleagues, and more than anything, to the librarians, to the teachers, and to the children. Thank you all for your wonderful discussions, and to everyone here, and for this wonderful panel. Very well done.